Now I'm going to show you some tips for using Eclipse. If you're already really familiar with Eclipse, you can probably just go ahead and skip this part because I'm just going to go over some pretty basic stuff. But if you're new to Eclipse or you've been using Eclipse and you just like to see some tips here, this might be pretty useful for you. The first thing I want to cover here is to look at the different perspectives. In Eclipse, you have a thing called perspective, which is basically just a setup of what you see in your IDE. The basic one we're looking at here is a Java setup where we have a package explorer, we have our problems down here at the bottom in console, and our source files. When we edit a file, it shows up in here. When you're debugging, you're going to want to click the debug perspective, and it's going to have your stack trace here of where you are, variables, breakpoints, all this important stuff for debug here, and as well as the controls for stepping through. And then Android gives us a perspective called DDMS. And this DDMS perspective is really useful for Android development. You can find things here like this has, when you have a device connected, it'll show you the device in here and the processes. You can click on a process and attach to the process to debug it. You can stop a process. You can take a screen capture of your Android application. So this is really useful stuff here. In the emulator control, when you're connected to an emulator, you can do things like pass in telephone information. I use this one a lot, the GPS. You can pass in GPS coordinates, play back an actual GPS session. It's actually pretty useful. And then you have things here like a file explorer. If you've connected your phone or an emulator, you can look at the file system here. You can look at the memory allocation and heap size here, and then the various threads. And then the logcat is the logging that comes out from your Android application and from the Android operating system in general. So very useful, this DDMS screen. You're going to find yourself in here a lot for debugging your application and figuring out what's going on. Some of the other things that we want to look at here are another Android specific thing is the Android Virtual Device Manager. I had shown this in one of the previous modules, but this allows you to create a new virtual device. So you can create an emulator here and you can specify different API levels. And this is really useful for testing different screen resolutions, different configurations. A lot of times I'll create different phones that I know exist out there and basically simulate that phone in the emulator here so I can test it. Now some Eclipse specific things, shortcuts that I wish I would have known when I first started working with Eclipse. The first one I'm going to give you, and I'll show these in some slides later, so you don't worry, you don't have to write them down. You'll have some slides. Control-Shift-T. This opens a type. This is very useful for finding a type. Let's say we want to find that my class. You can just type it in, click enter, and there you go. So that's to find any type, Control-Shift-T. Control-Shift-R is just like Control-Shift-T, except this one is going to open a resource. So like the main.xml file. You can find it right there. And that's really useful for navigation. I can't stress how important it is. Control-Shift-T, Control-Shift-R. Okay, Control-O, we can use that one when we're already inside of a class. We hit Control-O, and this is going to give us a really, perhaps the nicest I've seen in an IDE feature that allows us to search for methods and variables and anything inside that class. In this case, we only have the onCreate here, but you can use wildcards here and that'll work. And it's really, really quite useful when you have, especially when you have a big class file and you're trying to find something in it. It'll take you right to that method or variable. Shift-Alt-R is the next one. This one is rename. Let me actually select something we can rename here. So if we wanted to rename this onCreate, which we probably shouldn't do, we can just rename the file or the type right here, and it'll rename it for everywhere that references it. You'll probably use that one a lot also. Control-Shift-O will organize your imports. So you have all these imports here, and if we had an import that we weren't using, for example, import android.os. A sync task, right? We're not actually using that. So if I hit Control-Shift-O, it disappears. The other thing that will do for us is if I had something like text view here and I hit Control-Shift-O, it's going to pull in that import when I use it. So if I hit, and now you can see text view just showed up here. So that is actually really useful. You're going to want to keep that in mind as you're doing different things. You know, had a button here and hit Control-Shift-O, the button comes in. So it's going to make it a lot easier than trying to remember where does this thing live and how do I import it. That's a really useful one. You can hold down the Control button on your keyboard in order to go to the definition of things. This is also really useful. If you use ReSharper in Visual Studio, you're probably already familiar with this, but to go to the definition, it's pretty nice. And then the other Android specific one that's really important is to be able to refactor a string out. Let me create a string here. So I have a string here. I want to put this into an Android resource file so that I can localize it. So I can just go up to refactor, Android, extract Android string. And there's a shortcut key for this as well. I never remember it, but here you go. And then you can just extract it. And then when I hit OK here, it's going to show up. It's going to use get string to get it here. And then it's going to show up in this string file.